Welcome to part one of the K lecture. And without further ado, let's jump directly into the content we have for you today. Part one is all about introducing the K to folks who do not have a lot of experience with criticisms. If you don't, that's okay. Hopefully this lecture will help to show you new ways to think about debate, but also assumptions that people make in their everyday lives. When we look from a historical perspective, criticisms haven't been around that long, for only about 29 years. The first criticisms existed to stop and disrupt the flow of debate. What does that mean when we say disrupt the flow of debate? Well, it means that most policy debate discussions are centered around the plan text. They want you to focus on how fiat allows us to have discussions about scenarios that may come out of certain actions that we take from a political perspective. But the criticism isn't really worried about that, right? Instead, the criticism says we should begin to have other conversations. We should instead determine whether or not the offer is good or bad, not based on fiat, not based on the plan itself, but based on the assumptions that the AF makes. And assumptions is going to be kind of a theme that you hear throughout the entirety of this lecture. And it's all about understanding that every statement we make that is political has several underlying assumptions that informs why people would make such a statement. So let's talk about now some fundamental concepts that exist with criticisms. The first one is that criticisms exist to question everything all the time. Like I said before, assumptions are things that we have, or ideas that we have, or beliefs that we have. They're concepts that we have that are informed by something prior to us developing those things. The resolution has assumptions. The camp AF has assumptions. All affirmatives you will ever debate have assumptions because people have to formulate how they think about things before they decide how to act. The second thing about assumptions is that assumptions help us, when we expose them, they help us reveal certain truths around different discussions. That means that just because you believe, for instance, that criminality or crime is something that is inherently bad, which we'll get to later on, doesn't necessarily mean that that has to correlate directly with prison time or with jailing or with incarceration. Second concept you need to understand is that criticisms are really fundamentally about understanding theories of power. So what does that mean? A theory of power better helps us to understand how the world operates. What controls whether something is believed to be good or bad? How do we know whether or not something is favorable or unfavorable or beneficial or not? Well, because certain societal structures predetermine whether or not an action is good or an action is bad. We'll get into that more later on. The second part to that is it also determines how things come into play. A very interesting concept that I want you all to think about for a second here is what's more important, public perception or law? Is public perception more important when determining whether or not a person is guilty, or is law more important when determining when a person is guilty? I'll circle back around to that question later on, but I want you to ponder on that for a second. It will be okay even here if you pause your video and think about that question. Is it about what society wants, or is it about what the law says when we think about criminality? The last part of the concept that you must understand is how do things interact? How is it that we come to know things about the world and then make determinations about why certain actions will be better than others? The criticism attempts to expose all of that information and help to characterize or even direct you in how you should respond when faced with those instances of assumptions, theories of powers, and inaccurate or accurate interactions that take place. Now we're going to spend some time defining the criticism to help you better understand what it is. So when we say criticism, the first thing that's important is for you to understand that uniqueness is not something that matters to the criticism. We don't have to win that oppression is high or low now, or that imprisonment is high or low now, or that racism is high or low now, or any other form of philosophical kind of inquiry into the affirmative. The affirmative has set the stage and told us everything we need to know about how they feel about the world. Our job now is to make sure that we can explain that in a way that directly relates to the affirmative, or to the topic, or to the performance of the affirmative. The thing to remember, though, additionally, is that the criticism is really a negative position that's a mixture of a disad and a counterplan, without the uniqueness, though. The criticism says that there are consequences to the affirmative that takes place, and that we have provided an alternative solution to those consequences, which is why it's a mixture of both a disad and a counterplan, because a disad identifies consequences of the plan, and a counterplan attempts to take an alternative route to getting to solving those things. The K activates both of those portions of negative positions and attempts to roll them into one without worrying about whether or not a different portion of society or a different kind of political act is high or low now. The next thing you need to remember is that fiat, according to criticisms, doesn't matter. Believe it or not, and I know this may be difficult for you to understand, your aff doesn't actually do anything. I'll say it again. Your affirmative doesn't really do anything. All that we get from debate is the education that we receive in these spaces, in contestation, in our research. Fiat is a tool we use to say that if we could imagine that X event would happen, what would be the consequences or the benefits of that event? That's what fiat is. But fiat is not an explanation of how you resolve things in the world, nor is it an explanation of how you adequately deal with injustice or violence that exists in the world. And the K points that out directly. Additionally, criticisms tend to prefer individual action over policy. They say that instead of thinking about how policies affect entire groups of people, we should look at what we can do, what as individuals, whether you're a debater or you're the judge in the round, what we can do in the debate to contribute to alleviating oppression or harm that certain groups of individuals experience. Now, there are three basic parts of the criticism and two more advanced concepts that I want to talk about for a second. The basic parts of the criticism are the link, the impact, and the alternative. Well, your links are things that directly tie themselves to the plan, the purpose of the affirmative, i.e. the resolution or the discussion that you're having, the performance of the affirmative team, or the debate round itself. Links attach themselves and point out inadequacies or problems with the assumptions that the affirmative team has. Your impacts operate the same way as they do with traditional policy debate arguments, being disads and counterplans. Impacts simply highlight the forms of violence that will take place if the plan happens, or if the affirmative's logic is continued, or if their performance is continued and accepted. Finally is the alternative. The alternative is an opportunity for us to kind of approach debate and approach solutions in a radically different way than how we would normally approach them. And I'm going to get into specific examples of each one of these on the following slide, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that the three basic parts, the three main parts of a criticism, the link, the impact, and the alternative. The advanced parts of the criticism are a little bit different. They're generally the framework and or the role of the ballot, which we'll also talk about in a second. Framework is telling the judge what to prioritize and often requires you to give an additional piece, which is to tell the judge why prioritizing that particular thing is beneficial or good. The role of the ballot is about telling the judge what purpose voting has in this particular debate. Debates are not always about just winning and losing. Sometimes we have pedagogical discussions or educational discussions that lend themselves to providing a different perspective and allows us to grow, to learn something new and apply that. Sometimes that application comes through convincing the judge that your particular strategy is better or your particular education you've offered is better, which is the justification for calling for the ballot in order to recognize who did the better job debating about the particular subject that you are debating. So, critiques come in all kind of categories. Critiques come in all shapes and sizes. But there are three main categories that I want to focus on right now. The first are critiques that think about the case. These critiques primarily focus on the specific plan action that takes place in the affirmative, which means that they will have a lot of very specific links to the action of the affirmative. They will have very specific links to the actor of the affirmative as well. The second category of critique would be the presentation or the performance of the AF. There are different types of critiques that allow you to question the assumption of the rate of speed at which people are speaking. There are critiques that allow you to question the use of certain rhetoric that they use. There are critiques that allow you to question whether or not the idea of simulation and scenario planning is even good. All of these would fall on the category of the presentation or performance of the affirmative. The final category would be critiques of debate. Now, whether or not you realize it, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the new debate or non-traditional style section that comes actually in lecture, in part 2 of the lecture. But debate, although it is a great educational activity, models itself after our society. And our society is based on several assumptions and several presumptions that allow for exclusionary norms to exist, that allow for privilege to exist and to thrive. Debate is no different. Being able to attend, even a camp like this requires resources. Being able to have a staff requires resources. Being able to have access to internet, computers, and having the free time to be able to participate in this are all forms of privilege. So recognizing how our activity requires such privilege is part of preparing to have discussions about how some of the assumptions we make, some of the things we take for granted may not be things other people have access to. And that could be a reason for us to overlook certain perspectives or certain ideas that we may have about the world that are not consistent with how the world actually operates. Debate allows us to do that. This practice and simulation of debate allows for a form of voyeurism that perpetuates exclusion and allows us to distance ourselves from material violence that happens every single day. We'll talk a little bit more about that in part 2 of the lecture, though. So, what types of links exist? Well, first you have your language links. These links primarily attach themselves to arguments that are made based on the discourse that's found in cards, or even in taglines, or even in speeches of your opponent. If your opponent says something problematic, then punishing them for it is completely within the realm of possibility. A very popular thing that is often said that shouldn't be said that much is gender language. Several people use it all the time, whether it's the misidentification of proper pronouns or whether it's the simple use of guys in a speech to individuals that you have not asked how they identify or what pronoun they prefer. These are forms of discourse, of discoursal violence, that there are criticisms that attached to the way that we think about and begin to break down those performances or acts. The second type of link is words that exist in the resolution. From United States to criminal justice reform or the idea of criminal, all of these are words that we can find in the resolution that we can challenge the use of them, the existence of them, Or we can also build cases. What does it mean when we say criminal justice reform? Has there been criminal justice reform in the past? Has it worked? Is it working? Should we trust it to work in the future? All of these are questions that we can tease out. All of these are assumptions that have been made by the affirmative to be true, and they may not be true. Additional forms, and I won't go through each and every one of these, but additional forms are things even like the system that you assume exist. A great example of a system-based link would be one that criticizes the notion of state-based solutions. Yes, we do have a federal government, and yes, that federal government has laws, but do laws, again, remember the question I asked you, are laws really the thing that structure society? Do they really move us forward? Do they really control how the population acts? Those are the fundamental questions we want to get into, and these are the different type of links. Here are some examples of impacts that you could find, often used. Systemic simply means impacts that are ongoing. Racism, sexism, ableism, heteronormativity. All of these are systemic impacts that exist because there are people that are dealing and suffering from these in the status quo. There are also impacts like extinction, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The final part of this is the alternative, which alternatives are generally considered to be the most tricky part of the criticism. And it's very interesting when you think about it. An alternative is just saying there's probably a different way that we can resolve this problem that we have. And in most of the time, the trap we end up falling into is we end up thinking that alternatives have to take some concrete action. But if you take a second and you step back and just remember, if the AF doesn't do anything, why is it that there's a double standard for the alternative to do something additional? And the answer is it isn't. It's all about understanding the best way to think about your alternative, to deconstruct the affirmative, or to make it a movement or something personal that you can do to access solvency or to access a way to explain how you potentially solve the problem. I'll talk about two of the alternative types because I think they're going to be the most prominent on this particular topic. First, rethinking alternatives. Rethinking alternatives pose us with the possibility of saying, because we know that this structure exists, because we know that this political action exists, how can we begin to refuse participation in that particular structure or political action and instead reorient ourselves in another direction? When you have a rethinking alternative, it's not always about knowing the final solution because we may not know that. It's about saying that it's enough to reject the affirmative because they need to go back and revise the ideas, the concepts, or the plan that they have because it failed to meet the criteria of what you thought was necessary. The second alternative type is a movement/personal action alternative. This year presents us with a very unique opportunity. There are there are protests happening right now throughout the United States. There are people that are fighting for recognition and equity. What are we doing? Are we just sitting in classrooms? Are we just watching videos? Are we joining in that resistance? Your age, your ability, your resources don't matter. An alternative of movement or personal action simply requires you to be committed to the idea that change is necessary. This one might, This one requires a little bit more of a concrete idea of what you want. Because it says that we all have, to a certain extent, some skin in the game. What you do with that is your decision, but you should make that decision quickly. So when we talk about critiques generically, there are certain types of criticisms that exist, okay? The first type are just thinking criticisms. You'll have a criticism that wants to challenge presuppositions and assumptions about rules, frameworks, structures, and systems of thought. Remember, thinking criticisms challenge presuppositions and assumptions about rules, frameworks, structures, and systems of thought. A great example for a structure would be capitalism. Thinking criticisms would say, once we recognize that capitalism is simply a social construct, it is an economic system that we have created, that we place value on things because of our desires, then we can reorient or we can rethink ourselves out of the relationship of value for material objects and therefore collapse capitalism on itself. The second type would be rhetoric and language case that exists. We talked about this earlier. Gendered language is very prominent in our society. It's very prominent in the debate community. Figuring out ways to say the things you want to say without being offensive is a good practice, first for winning debates, but also second for being a good person. It's important that we kind of watch the language we use. Excuse me. Even that was problematic. You see that? We catch ourselves when we correct it. It's important that we recognize how the language that we use, and sometimes things that we say, can be harmful or offensive to other people. Our goal should always be to be better people, and rhetoric and language case sometimes help us cross that bridge. It may be difficult in the moment to deal with it, but learning experiences is how we challenge not only ourselves, but our peers around us. And it makes us better people at the end of the day. The final type of criticism would be a value criticism. Value criticisms challenge the premise or expose contradictions at either the external or internal ethical levels of the affirmative. Internal ethical levels, for a great example, would be for a decarceration ad, is the thought process that intrinsically releasing people from prison is enough, and that you have done something worthy of a ballot to say that you want to release people from prison. Is that me saying that abolition is bad? No, not at all. But have we looked at whether or not that your desire to release them from prison is founded in a desire to improve the condition of Black and brown life? Or is it to further push the agenda of a state that wants control over Black and brown lives? Once they get out, what happens next? Where do they go? Is it possible for them to go back to prison? What happens? Your value system is often painted by the goals that you've set by yourself. And when we recognize that the goals we've set sometimes don't meet up with the actions we think they should, that is where the value, our criticism of value, comes into play. Because we begin to understand what we value may not have been actually that Black or brown life, but instead incrementalism. Small changes that don't constitute change. I want to leave you with a few thoughts before I close out for this first section. It's important to remember that Ks come in all different shapes, sizes, and kind of argumentation. They can be combined in a multiplicity of ways. But generally speaking, you should not combine criticisms. You should figure out what the criticisms are. You should make sure that you have all the components of your criticism, and you should try to execute that strategy to the best of your ability. If you're going to do any mixtures of criticism, here's a few pieces of advice. First, try and keep them all in the same school of thought. Make sure not to mix criticisms, or don't mix between postmodernism and post-structuralism. Don't mix between Baudrillard and Schopenhauer. Don't mix between Wilderson and Best. All of these are different authors that have completely different ranges of thought. I would say if you're going to combine things, do it at the link level. But you have to make sure that the link is resolved by the alternative. Because if it's not, then you just have an alternative argument that won't have an impact. Remember, the K is constructed through the link, the impact, and the alternative. So today we've talked about the history of the K. I've given you some foundational concepts for thinking about the criticism, really challenging the way that you view the criticism. I've defined a K and talked about the parts of the K. And this is the first part of a 3-part series on the criticism. Thank you so much. Bye.